to the authors. The authors have an identity is known to the reviewers, and of course to the editor. And in about sometime after this, Hart came to the United States and gave a talk to a large group of North American physicians. BMJ had already used this for 20 years and found that it was working. The North American physicians completely ignored it. It had no effect on the way North American editors operated or did their journals. They still did the same thing. They made the decision, very rarely they would go outside and ask, and outside meant down the hall. It never meant anywhere else. And it continued like that in medicine and all kinds of other fields. So we're talking across the board, this was going on quite a bit. And practices really only changed after World War II. And what's interesting about that, and surprising to me, but based on people who have studied this pretty intensively, each editor and each journal reinvented the wheel. They didn't go to other fields and ask. They didn't even look. They just sort of evolved a policy. But there were two constraints after World War II that began to get them all to go in the same direction, or at least go in the same direction, but slowly and without knowing anybody else was doing it and not even caring, because the disciplines seemed to be so split. And the first was there was increasing competition for page space, because now all of a sudden research was beginning to be produced in large numbers. And secondly, they were now beginning to realize that the editor didn't have the specialization that was required. Some editors resented this greatly. There's a famous story of one medical editor who was continuing to review everything and make decisions without any counsel at all. And when he was sort of subjected to some kind of criticism, he got very huffy and said, if I can't evaluate everything in medicine, well then that's ridiculous. It's just impossible. Of course I can. We all can. It just so happens I'm the editor. I wouldn't be, if we couldn't do that, if one person couldn't do that, what kind of physician would I be? So he totally did not believe that he needed folks. But others were beginning to realize that they did, in fact. So we have a peer review system that in some ways we inherited, or we at least developed as a basis of competition and specialization. We needed people outside. We went to those folks outside because the people on our floor didn't know anything about this. But there have been criticisms of this peer review system, something about it that's not quite right. One of the things that the British will say about this, many of the British medical scientists and sociologists of science all over the world will say that there's something that is not quite ethical. Now, maybe ethical is not the right word, but the basic idea is that in the usual peer review system, the reviewer knows who you are, but the author has no idea who's reviewing them. And we'll see, we're going to revisit that assumption, but clearly that's been viewed as, in some ways, not quite ethical, not quite right by many people. Of course, the other criticism is it's real slow. You're going to see some of the options I suggest do not cure that problem, but they may change the playing field in a way. But clearly, it seems very slow. It certainly seems slow, and I think is slow in a lot of social and personality psychology. It also requires not only the tremendous effort of the authors, obviously, but it requires tremendous effort from the reviewers and from the editors, and this causes, and I think that Dwayne Wegner is going to talk about this, a kind of burnout or a kind of I did my time, I don't want to do my time again because my time took so much effort. Clearly, editors and reviewers feel that they're always pushing the rock or the ball or whatever up the hill because the submissions are continuing to come in. Certainly when I was at PSPB, I forgot what we were getting, 3-4 manuscripts a week. And that's child's play compared to what medical journals get. But that, you began to feel, gee, that's a big rock I'm pushing. But the other criticism, of course, which is not as so well known, though sociologists of science and others have done studies on this, reviewer consensus is just terrible. Rarely ever above 0.3. 0.3 is actually a good estimate. And by the way, I should also mention, for those of you who have heard the argument maybe from others, that it's much better in the, quote, hard sciences, don't believe it. It is not the case. Ooh, only 5 minutes. Well, we're going to go a little quicker. It's not better. This is a quote from Robert Bornstein, who I really love this quote. Although we regard manuscript reviews as a test or a measure of scientific worth, even a cursory reading of the APA's standards for educational and psychological testing reveals that this test fails with respect to every technical criterion for establishing the reliability and the validity of an assessment instrument. So we're using this to determine whether things get in the pages or get online, but consensus between the reviewers or among reviewers is not good. So why do we require so many reviews now? We didn't before, but now we do. First, I think there's a social psychology to this, or a psychology to it. Neither the reviewer or the editor wants the reputation of being insufficiently rigorous, especially in the context of knowing there are many more submissions than space. And this is where it's important to note that other fields have the same low reviewer consensus, but they accept many more papers. In physics journals, even in Physics Review or Physics Notes, two of the most prestigious journals in all of science, they accept 80% of what they get. Now, they have other economic things that go on there that contribute to some extent, but that won't explain all of it. And of course, we seek 4 or 5 reviews. Usually, unless the editor waits for excessive lengths of time, 1 or 2 will arrive. But why only 1 or 2? Well, one argument that people don't talk about a lot is maybe we choose inappropriate reviewers. They're not really relevant to the topic. But maybe reviewing is a low priority in the scheme of things. It's certainly not when you're an author. You're thinking about the review all the time. It's not a low priority. You want a good reviewer, or maybe what you want is a reviewer who likes you and likes what you did. So what are the options to consider? And that's what I want to talk about mostly. I'm not advocating any of them. And in fact, I'm not going to argue all these options necessarily take care of the problems I've talked about previously. They all don't. What I'm mostly arguing for, my modest proposal, I guess, is we don't talk about this. We don't discuss this. We don't consider it. And so it ends up just being a given. So why don't we have signed reviews? In the biomedicine area, there is some evidence on this, doing some randomized clinical trials of a sort in which there are signed reviews and non-signed reviews, where they manipulate the quality of a real manuscript by putting in flaws of various kinds. So far, those signed reviews don't affect the review quality. It does affect the review decision. People are more likely to say accept in a reviewer. But it doesn't change the ratings. If you give people ratings of things, it doesn't change that. So you could say the editor can make the decision about the threshold. I don't want to argue this is real good science that they've done, in part because they are in biomedical science. This is not what they do. There are other people who ought to do this kind of research. Guess who do you think ought to do it? I don't know why we shouldn't be doing it, because it's the kind of stuff we kind of know how to deal with design problems. Or Bornstein's adversary model, which I won't have full time to explain. And I don't want to argue again, I'm advocating for this, but I just want you to know about it. His adversary model basically is